Welcome to the Even Better podcast, where your host, Sinica Waugh of Your Clear Next Step, brings you exciting content about making communities better by helping people get even better at work.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. This is Sinica Waugh with the Even Better podcast. We're so glad you joined us today. This is in our continuing mission to help people have better work days. And today I am delighted to introduce our guest, Becky Naderman. Becky, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
We are so delighted. So for those of you who don't know Becky, she is an occupational therapist here in the central Iowa area. I have known her for a year-ish, maybe a little bit more, give or take. COVID kind of eliminated my understanding of time these days, but it's been a bit that Becky and I have been connected and have known each other. And I have been so inspired with the book that Becky wrote, Walk With Me, and we'll talk about that, I'm sure, in this conversation. And recently in May of 2021, Becky shared her story and her message on TEDx Des Moines. And it just was some wonderful things that we'll get to hear about Becky and her story. She's also a mom. And so we connect on the, raising teenage daughters point of view. And we both live here in central Iowa and have many things in common. And I'm so humbled and so privileged to have Becky here with us. Becky, thank you for taking the time and for putting yourself out there with your story of your own experiences. I know you're going to be talking a little bit about relationships and forming relationships. That's part of our message today. But can you talk to us a little bit, your story? Tell us who you are a little bit and how you came to this point that you would want to share about forming relationships with people who seem different than ourselves.
Well, as you said, I'm an occupational therapist, and most of my career has been spent in home health care. And so in that environment, I'm going into 5 to 6 homes a day of people that are complete strangers to me. And sometimes I speak their language, sometimes it's very different on a socioeconomic status. And so that has allowed me to meet many different people from different walks of life. And so in 2016, I started reading books about incarceration. It started with one book that just happened, and then I was interested and I started reading more books. And eventually over time, I found out that a coworker of mine had a brother who was incarcerated. And so after reading on the topic, I really had a lot of compassion for her situation. And so I reached out to her with just a note of empathy. And from that interaction, she then passed on to her brother. I had given her a gift of cash for the next time she visited him because I knew that she supported him and I knew that she paid for a sitter. So she had passed the cash on to her brother, Aaron, who then wrote me a thank you note. And so from that thank you note, it was a very nice thank you note. And I could see this person of peace and joy. And the truth is that those were things I was looking for in my own life. And that surprised me. I didn't expect that someone who was incarcerated would have peace and joy when I was out here living this life that was supposed to be what everybody worked toward. And yet I was still striving for those things. So that's how I entered this friendship. And over time, he invited me to visit him at the prison. And then that's when a lot of the real learning began for me, because I was in an environment that was nothing like anything I had been in before. And it allowed me to really look within myself and question long-held beliefs that I had and ask myself hard questions.
Well, that's something that we all need to be doing these days, is looking at the long-held beliefs that we've had and asking ourselves hard questions about what we believe and what we think and what's true and what's not true, and how we can show genuine love to people around us, and where we need things that we've got so much that we've got to learn. Becky, I so appreciate your willingness to share this story and to share some of the insights that you learned through this process with the rest of us. And so we're going to just get right into it. You are here today talking about 5 main points of forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us. So it's about relationship, and anyone who's listened to our podcast knows that relationships and the human connection is just a critical part of who we are and what we do as humans. And you have found 5 main points of forming relationships specifically with people who are different or appear far from us. So we'll dive right into the first one. And the first point that you shared is there's always more of the story. Oh, tell us about that, Becky.
Yes, Sinica, there's always more to the story. That's true of everybody we meet. Especially to give a little bit of background information. If society looked at me and they looked at Aaron, For me, they would probably say she's a white middle class working mom. And they would look at Aaron and they would say he's a Black man who's incarcerated for a despicable crime. But as is true of all of us, there's more to our story than that. And when I got to know Aaron's story more, I found someone who had a history that seemed to lead him to where he was with very limited choices. For example, when he was a child, he was moved from different homes. Sometimes he'd be with his parents, sometimes with grandparents. At times he was with a teacher. And so that background led to lots of instability for him and inconsistency, and left him on his own a lot of times to fend for himself. And so knowing that information, that really caused me to understand how some of the what we would call choices that he was faced with really looked less like choices and more like what he had to do to survive.
That's a powerful example. As we think about more to someone's story, right? It's not just the way we see them here. It's about the journey that they've been on and the steps that brought them here and the life experience that they've encountered. Is there connection there, Becky, with the title Walk With Me? Like that's part of a journey. It's part of unfolding that story. Is there connection there?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Walk With Me is about going on the journey with someone, whatever that journey is. And part of that journey is looking back and seeing where someone has walked from. But also part of it is accepting that this is a situation that they're in. You know, a lot of times we want to change somebody's situation, but true friendship is a lot about accepting where someone is.
I love that. The point about there's always more to the story. I think about the cautionary tales that moms felt, especially when Pinterest came to the forefront and everybody seemed to be posting these perfectly posed Pinterest pictures. And I don't think I could say that twice. And the perfect lifestyles on Facebook, and the things that are out there is everybody's just so, and the kids are all clean and their hair is brushed and everybody's smiling on their way into church on Sunday mornings. And there's more to the story there if we take the time to really build relationship and know that we all struggle on Sunday mornings and Monday mornings and Tuesday mornings and all the other mornings, right?
I totally agree. And I think that is something that we so easily lose sight at in an era of social media. It's because we have these perfect images in front of us. But I also think that it's valuable to remember that there's more to the story when we're in the grocery line and something turns chaotic. Whether it's the person who's checking us out seems to have a mood, or if it's the person that's in front of us or behind us, that there were events that happened before they got there. The same is true of our coworkers when we walk into work in the morning. There was something that happened before they got there. Maybe it was great and maybe it wasn't.
Yeah. I recall you've mentioned that in building this relationship with your friend Aaron, that part of that story was even uncovering the story with his sister, that you had been a colleague with was it his sister, and discovered in that conversation there was more to the story, that there was more that she knew about people being incarcerated. And it was because you were curious about that story that you and she started in a conversation.
Yes, we were sitting at lunch one day, just having our normal lunch conversation, and the topic of incarceration came up in the conversation, which was unusual. But from the reading that I had done, I recognized that she had more insight than the rest of us. And that insight showed up in the form of compassion in the way that she responded. And so I could tell that she had an experience that the rest of us didn't. And so I asked her about it. And that's how I came to know that her brother was incarcerated.
Oh. So we're here with Becky Naderman, and we're talking about 5 points of forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us. And the first point is there's always more of the story. And the second point, let's move on to that. So we're more alike than we are different. I know this is an important topic for you, Becky. I remember seeing big numbers on the screen in your TEDx Des Moines. Talk to us about that. So we're more alike than we are different.
So the National Human Genome Research Institute actually found that any two human beings on this planet are 99.9% genetically alike. And as I was writing the book and I came across that, I couldn't leave that, because I thought about how much time we spend focusing on how we're different, and to think that at our core, we're really the same as human beings. And And then to think about the possibility of what if we focused on our sameness with the same amount of emphasis and enthusiasm and dedication that we focus on our differences? How could our world look differently? And so specifically with my friendship with Aaron, like I said, we looked really different on the outside. But when I got to know him, we found that we had a shared taste in music. We like to read the same types of books and discuss them. And we had, we had that common desire to be known, to be loved, to give love, to be recognized, to be seen. And I think that we all share that, and when we remember that, it's so much easier to move past the differences that seem loud and obvious and find that, you like to spend time with your family and have a really good meal just like I do. And, sharing a really good laugh with a friend is really enjoyable for all of us. And if we start there, then it's a lot easier for us to go into more difficult areas where we do have differences of opinion.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. So the next point that you made really, I think, is one that we're going to have to stop and be challenged by and just hang out in, even if it's uncomfortable. And this third point that you were making about forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us is you encourage us not to run when we see our own deficits. Becky, what's the story there?
It's a big one. When I started going into the prison, I lived in this small town that had the prison that I would drive past probably hundreds of times. I drove past it and I would see the men exercising in the yard. And so as I drove past, I had lots of ideas about, wondering about who was there, what did they do, did they learn their lesson? These judgments that I had that were just ideas as I drove past. I didn't really look any deeper into them. I didn't ask myself questions about them. But the first time I went to the prison, I had to wait a really long time in the visiting room for Aaron to come, like over an hour and a half as I waited there. And so I was sitting there surrounded by other tables of men who were getting visits on that day. And my wait was incredibly and unusually long. And so they started to notice it. And I started hearing these tables saying things to each other like, gosh, she's been waiting so long. And I wonder if he knows she's here. And, they're hardly going to have time to visit. Visiting hours are almost up. And it really struck me because all those times that I drove past the prison and I had ideas about, what do they do in a day? Or, I wondered, what had they done that got them there? Did they learn their lesson? I never considered that they were kind and compassionate and caring like I was. And so I really had to ask myself, why didn't I ever think about that before? Why didn't I ever consider that? And so it's easy, I think, when those situations arise to come up with excuses for ourselves or stuff them down so that we don't have to think about that which is unpleasant within us. But I found that if I could really lean into that and courageously look and say, where is that coming from? And why are you thinking that, Becky? That it allowed me to have space to move beyond it. And so then the next person that I would meet and I would feel some kind of judgment coming up or an idea would come to my head, I could say, wait a minute, you had it wrong before. Is this true? And that allowed me to really get past those barriers of judgment.
Seeing our own deficits, wrestling with that, wrestling with our awareness that we have made judgments, we have based ideas or formed opinions based on things that are simply not grounded in the truth. That's hard to do. That's tough to wrestle with. What do you do when it hurts?
I think for me, the topic of the incarcerated population is one that's near and dear to my heart. I believe in second chances really strongly. And I think that in order for that to happen, we have to be more compassionate as a society as a whole. And so if I could lean into my own deficits, then it's so much easier for me to accept them in someone else because I see myself as flawed too.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Thank you. So this ties into the fourth topic and these run together. They're very connected. I see that 5 main points of forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us. Your fourth point was that this growth depends on our willingness to be vulnerable. I assume that means growth in relationship, but that growth in ourselves, I assume too. Talk us through that. Growth depends on our willingness to be vulnerable.
Well, I think you can gather from my last example of being in the visiting room with other incarcerated men that I had some introspective work to do, and that allowed me to grow. But I also think that when we're vulnerable, there's a certain vulnerability within ourselves to be courageous enough to look at our deficits. But then vulnerability also calls us to share that experience with someone else. And that's the scariest point for us, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because we can kind of look at it within ourselves and deal with it. But then when I open it up and I share it with you, then it's out there. Everybody knows my secret now, right? They know that I was judging the incarcerated population. I have an example of something that had happened when my children were young. When my kids were young, I would take them to the YMCA. And while I was doing part of my workout, I wanted them to do something other than watching the TV. So I would have them walk the track. And one night while I had them walk the track, I didn't realize that they needed an adult to supervise them. And so my daughter comes frantically running to me and says, "Mom, a man was chasing us on the track." And, she's crying and she's upset. And not only that, but her sister isn't with her. And I'm thinking, I told you to stay together. Where's your sister? And so then she tells me, "I don't know where she is." And now I'm more panicked and I'm gathering my things to go. And in through the door walks an employee of the Y. And I'm so glad to see him because he's the guy who knows all the workings of the Y. He knows everything that's going on there. So he'll know where my daughter is. And of course he does. And he tells me he'll take her to her. And so I'm gathering my things to follow him and I'm settling down. And he says to me something very unexpected. He says, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to scare them. I was just trying to let them know they couldn't walk the track without an adult." And immediately, Seneca, my stomach just drops. And I know why my daughters ran from him. This employee was very easily approachable. He's, medium build, mild manner, middle-aged Black man. And I know this is why my daughters have run from him. And so that immediately says that to me that I haven't done my job as a parent. I haven't taught them what I wanted them to know. And so I go home and I share it with my husband. And then eventually I share the story. My husband and I then work to create opportunities for our daughter. We have discussions, we expose them to different things, and we start looking at what our own lives look like. But then I make the decision to include it in the book. And of course, that's a vulnerable moment for me and for my family. But what I found from that, and when I speak on that, I find that people start sharing their own story too. Mm-hmm. And so from that vulnerability, I grew from that experience. But then other people have also grown too, because there's a safety. And once that type of vulnerability is shared, then other people start sharing too. And then it's a place we can move from and grow from.
That's so powerful, Becky. Thank you for sharing that story. And even before we got started on this particular podcast episode, while we were visiting, I appreciated your vulnerability about your whole experience with the TEDx and through your journey in all of our conversations. You've been so in the relationship that you and I have built, you've been so willing to be vulnerable about your own growth. And I have found places where I have been able to grow because you've shared your own lessons. So thank you for doing that.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me, of course.
Yeah, you bet. So we're talking with Becky Naderman. And if you've not had the chance to watch her TEDx Des Moines talk, we'll make sure that the link is available with the podcast or somewhere nearby. And you can always go to Your Clear Next Step and find it. You can Google her, Becky Naderman, or the TEDx Des Moines in May of 2021. You can hear more about Becky's story. But we're here specifically talking about 5 points of forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us. And we encounter these relationships. And I think this fits into the mission of helping make workdays better, because sometimes we are forming relationships with people at work or in the workplace, perhaps new customers, perhaps new colleagues, perhaps it's a new environment. For those who are starting in a new workplace for the first time, everybody feels new and maybe they feel like they've been here for a long time. And of course, we need to be talking about diversity and equity and inclusion. This is a topic that we need to talk about. We need to talk about racism and the biases that exist that are so often so deeply ingrained, we don't even know they're there. And so part of the story here with Becky is bringing that to the forefront and allowing us to start that conversation. And I think one of the things that Becky has done so beautifully is gets us to the buildup for this fifth point as well, that is we're building relationships with people who appear different or far from us. Her first point is always more to the story. And her second is that we're more alike than we are different. Her third one that challenged us is don't run when you see your own deficits, when you see your own failings. That's not a reason to stop and to fall down. That's a reason to pick yourself up and lean in and be brave through that. And the fourth one was that growth, not just in yourself, but in others around you, depends on your willingness to be vulnerable. And let's talk about this fifth one. That fifth one is about creating learning opportunities for yourself. Becky, what does that mean? And how does that creating learning opportunities, how does that help us build relationships with people who appear different?
Well, I think we can always do things like we can read and we can watch documentaries and we can expose ourselves to ways of learning about different walks of life. But what I find valuable as a white woman in an environment where most of the people around me, I'm in the majority most of the time. It's valuable for me to put myself in a position of being in the minority. So putting myself in a position where I'm in groups of people where I'm not the majority allows me to be able to experience what it feels like for that brief period of time that I'm in that position to be in the minority. And I learn so much in that space. I often, one of the things I learn the most is how much less confident I am, or I learn how much I am more selective about the words that I choose. And I think about what it's like to live in that space all the time. And so then that can be impactful for me when I'm back in other situations where I'm in the majority. I can be a bridge to help with people who are in the minority because I remember what that experience was like for myself. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's not the same because it's this brief period of time. It's not my whole experience, but it's a way for me to grow in understanding.
Yeah, it's a way to, you're talking empathy. You're talking about creating an awareness of how someone else might be feeling in a given moment.
Right. And there's a difference between I read someone's experience or they tell me their experience, and then I have an opportunity to experience a little part of that. Like it's such a small sliver, right, Seneca? I mean, it's such a small sliver, but it's an experience for me to be able to relate to the stories that they've told me.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's so encouraging, Becky. Thank you. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to having you back. We'll have more podcasts, more conversations with Becky Naderman. This is the Even Better podcast, Becky. And one of the questions that we always ask before we start to wrap up is, what's making you even better right now?
In this last year, we've had so many challenges thrown at us. And I think one of the things that I try to hold on to is each day when I walk out my door, or better yet, when I get out of my bed, because there's people I encounter before I walk out my door, is to first just when life gets hectic and it gets difficult, to remember to love and not judge. Mm-hmm. If I can just lead with that, if all else fails and I'm stressed out and I don't know what to do, I can choose to love in a moment and not judge.
Oh boy, that's something we should all do a little more of. Thank you. Thank you, Becky. So if you want the opportunity to connect with Becky, her website is ranadermanwalkwithme.com. You can go out there. You can do a Google for Becky Naderman. You can look at the TEDx Des Moines. You'll find her passage there, and you can reach out to us at Your Clear Next Step, and we'll connect you with Becky. Becky, is there any other way for people to reach you that I didn't mention there that you'd prefer to have included?
I am on Facebook and I'm on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So for those of you who have been listening today, I thank you for joining in. I thank you for just stopping to think about 5 main points of forming relationships with those who appear different or far from us. And I encourage you to learn more about Becky's story and the learnings that she shares that help us then form better relationships and become better humans. And man, I couldn't say it better. So we'll end with Becky's comment about every day choosing to love and not judge. For those of you who have joined us, thank you so much. On behalf of all of us at Your Clear Next Step, we hope the rest of your day is even better.
Thank you for tuning in today. The Even Better podcast will be back with more content soon. But in the meantime, subscribe to our podcast or check out our website at yourclearnextstep.com for more information. See you next episode.